Welcome to Executive Access, created for motivated professionals. This is your home for real talk with executives about their career journeys, leadership practices, successes, and learnings along the way. I am your host, Jamie Tazi. Today, we're joined by Maureen Daily, former principal and current senior educator at Porter-Gaud School. I first experienced Maureen's leadership as a parent of the school, and I have long admired it. The way she communicates is absolutely masterful, and the innovation that came out of her leadership at the school was truly extraordinary. I had to find out how she did it. Maureen talks about the power of guiding principles and setting those in your leadership, the power of authenticity, and why it's so important to show people that you understand what they're going through. I also can't wait for you to hear why Maureen thinks that she was tapped to lead so many times and pretty much everything else about what she shares. Let's dive in. Maureen Daily, welcome to the Executive Access. I am so happy that you're here with me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm probably going to mess this up, but you graduated with your bachelor's in English from Stonehill College?
Yes.
And then you had a period of adventure, which you can tell us about. And then you went back to get your master's in of arts with a concentration in upper school English or
Yes,
English in
correct.
general. Fantastic. And then you spent most of your career, well, you started out in upper school teaching English,
Yes.
but spent most of your career in the middle school, which I don't know how you do that. Like that is like the hardest age, honestly.
Yeah.
Did I get all of that right? And maybe you can fill in the blanks a little bit for us.
You did. So, I'm a child of an educator. My father taught for over 30 years. My mother was a teacher for a little bit. And then kind of like me, she had an adventuresome personality. So when I was in undergrad studying English, people said, do you want to be a teacher? And I always said, no, I don't want to be a teacher. I don't want to be a teacher. And it's kind of like I resisted what I think my life's calling was for almost 10 years.
Wow.
But in between that time, I think I did a lot of things that informed who I am as a teacher and cultivated curiosity and dreaming and stories and writing. And so all of that kind of led to where I am, albeit through a circuitous path.
That's great. I always feel like there's no wasted experiences, right?
Yeah.
That all comes together.
Yeah.
Well, I am sort of a geek on leadership. I love just to observe people. I observe everything. And when I first saw you speak at the back to school and I didn't know you, I was like, wow. And I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
But before we go there, we have to talk about soccer because we are both soccer moms. Our two of my three boys and your two boys play on the same team currently at Porter-Gaud School.
Yes.
And I always laugh because I learned through this process of like soccer momming with you that we basically have the same parenting style. Because when Seamus got hurt, like before he even hit the ground, I hear you going, get up. And I'm like, that's exactly my parenting style as well.
It's it seems aggressive and kind of rough, but it's because I know him and I believe in him and I know the result that he's going to be happiest with is going to be one that he's dug in and worked really hard. And so, yes, I do yell, get up, you're fine. But at the end of the day, I'm obviously telling myself, like, I hope he is okay. But also, I know he'll feel a sense of worth if he gets up and fights through it.
That's so good.
As a mom, as someone who, played sports and coaches sports, like, that's what you look for. Like, dig in, have the strength. And so, yes, we are both get up.
And you know when I heard that, I was like, that's exactly what I do. I say get up because I want to encourage him.
Yeah.
And also part of me is like, please get up. Get up.
Yeah.
Don't be hurt.
Yeah.
So anyway, I love being out there with you on the soccer field. It's super fun. But going back, way back, before I even knew you, my kids had just entered the middle school. You were then the principal of the middle school, a phenomenal school called Porter-Gaud in Charleston that my sons and your sons attend. And you also teach and work there and were the principal there. And it was back to school night. I didn't know what to expect. And you get on stage and you did your, I would call it a keynote in the corporate world. I don't know what you call it, your presentation.
Yeah.
And I was just blown away. And so the thing I wanted to talk to you about is communicating effectively. I mean, the storytelling that you gave, it was warm, it was confident, it was exciting. And also there was an edge of like, yeah, and this is how we do it in the middle school. It was kind of bold and, like I remember thinking, wow, I'm not going to mess with her. Right. So, I talked to one of my earlier guests about this model that I'm really obsessed with called the warmth and competence model.
Mhm.
And, how when you first meet somebody, you are, sort of judged on, are they warm? Are they competent? And very few people can get into that zone where they somehow come across warm and competent at the same time. And that's what it was for you. And I'm just curious about where you learned your communication skills and how you do that actually.
Well, it's funny because since we've been talking, I've had to reflect back on, what is my journey before I start speaking, particularly to a large crowd.
Hmm.
And I'm actually terrified as a public speaker. I get really, really
Interesting.
nervous. My knees will shake and my hands will shake. And there are a lot of people who speak off the cuff, but I have found that I choose my words intentionally and I don't want to drop one.
Hmm.
So I've always read from a script that I've written. And when I prepare to speak to a group, it usually takes me 4 or 5 days to just have ideas in my head. And, you could think as a back to school person or someone who speaks at, a 8th grade celebration at the end of the year, you could say the same thing every year. And I always took pride in the fact that I didn't. And I think what gave me the depth and the ideas of what to dig into is I know my audience. And I think as a leader and as a communicator, you can be authentic if you know who you're speaking to.
Hmm.
And while I didn't know you personally, I knew your experience. I knew how apprehensive most people are when they hear the words middle school because it seems like a torture chamber, and you're thinking puberty and my kid's going to go through this and I'm scared. Um, and so I always tried to speak to that. And and I think more broadly, even at the end of an 8th grade year, if you can speak to your audience because you know your audience, that's where that warmth comes in.
Hmm.
Um, I also try to be funny, and sometimes my joke lands, and sometimes it doesn't.
I think it's very funny.
But my humor is a little edgy and sarcastic, and sometimes that can go over people's heads. More often than not, it gives people a sense of who I am as a person, and so maybe that's where that competence comes through, or that I'm projecting a fake confident because I'm not confident when I'm standing up there. I'm confident in my message. I'm confident in my story. I'm just looking out at an audience of hundreds of people and just trying to hold it together. And so I think if you believe in your story, people will believe your story.
Hmm.
And, I grew up, I'm Irish. The tradition of storytelling is huge in Irish culture. My father is a master storyteller and is a self-published author and has, captured our family history, but also he's had a really interesting life background. And so I've just always been infused with the way that you connect with people and the way that you can know people is by sharing some of your own story and trying to understand theirs.
Excellent. Well, there's so much in that. I mean, I'm hearing intentionality. So being super intentional about the message that you want to give and really prepping. I would not have picked up that you're nervous. I definitely assumed you prepared a lot. But to hear that, I think is really good because I believe that from a leadership perspective, communication and communicating effectively up and down and around is so impactful. So really putting in the time for that. I think I'm also hearing just thinking of others. And there's this great book that I also obsess about. I obsess about many things called Outward Mindset by Arbinger that really talks about like stop thinking about yourself so much and think about others. And so you were bringing that, right? You were thinking about, okay, all those students that are sitting there and their parents, and I felt that. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And, you want to be reassuring. Um, no one likes to feel alone. And so I think when you're speaking to someone and you're saying, like, I hear you, I hear your experience, it just gives people a sense of comfort and something that you can kind of, being on the other side of it, when I'm around a leader who projects that, it gives me a sense of, okay, someone else is going to help carry this. Like, I'm worried for the next stage. I don't know what's going to come next. That person seems like she gets that. So I feel like I'm going to be okay. And that's kind of what I always tried to be. I always tried to be approachable, accessible, and even in giving a speech in front of people to come across as approachable and accessible.
Well, and I love that because I often, everything's going to be okay, or I understand how you feel. You don't, as a leader, have to always solve the problems because sometimes you won't be able to yet, right?
Right.
But even just to take that first step and say, before we talk about what we're going to do about it or solve the problems, or you want to be like the person with the cape, it's just like, hey, I get you. And the other person is feeling like, okay, she totally gets it. She totally gets it. So now I'm leaning into what's next.
Yeah. And the nervousness, it never went away. I spoke this morning at the 8th grade celebration. I was presenting 2 awards, and they were to 2 kids that I cared deeply about and that I love them for their individuality. And I had a kernel of an idea in my head, like probably 2 weeks ago. And I just let that rattle around and play with phrases in my head, but I actually didn't write what I was going to say until 6:45 this morning. But I had let the idea kind of percolate and bake, and my nervousness forces me to tinker and make it good. Yes. And I don't want to be a bragger, but I feel like I nailed those 2 talks this morning, but because I had let it spend time in my brain, and because my nervousness is make it right, make it good. If you're not nervous and you go into something with a false confidence, sometimes your product won't be as good.
Oh, I feel like I could tell. I've made that mistake where I sort of winged it, and it wasn't my best.
Yeah.
And I can also tell when people are so experienced at their craft that they've lost that edge a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even preparing for this podcast, I'm a little nervous, right? And I keep telling myself that's what's going to make it better, though.
Exactly.
Right? And exactly what you're describing.
Yeah.
And I also, your authenticity. I love that. What you said about just, kind of being yourself. We talk a lot in the corporate world about authenticity, and everybody's like, yeah, be authentic. And it's easier said than done, I think, because you also feel like you have to project this image of who others think you should be as a fill in the blank, as a principal, as a executive, as a early in career professional. How did you get over that? Because you did come across, I think I have the same edgy humor as you. So I picked up on those little barbs, kind of like when you watch a Disney movie and there's like these other little level of thing. But how did you get over that? Was there a point in your career where you were able to get over that you can think of?
So I am a nerd. I loved being in college. I loved going back to graduate school. And I had this professor when I was doing my Master's of Arts in Teaching. And Duke is a very branded university. When you arrive, they give you like Post-it notes with the name of your degree on it. And I still remember we had this Post-it note and every page had a different word on it. And it was how to prepare to be a professional teacher. And Duke's ethos was that you had to be authentic. They preached authenticity from the first day. And wisely, they said, kids are the greatest discerners of personality.
Wow.
And I didn't know, I was preparing to teach high school. I would say middle school kids are the greatest discerners of personality, that they can spot fakeness from a mile away. And so even from an intellectual standpoint, the idea of authenticity was ingrained in me. But, I also think at the end of the day, you have to put your head to the pillow and say, I have been who I am and I'm comfortable with who I am. And being comfortable with who you are is probably the hardest part of that process. For me, when I was asked to be the division head, it was, we had lost a principal suddenly. He went home with a stomach ache and died 48 hours later.
Horrible.
It was traumatic and horrible. And at the time, I had zero interest in being an administrator, which might be why they asked me. But I remember going to my first series of meetings and going to a conference in the summer that was it was a Southern subset of division heads. And I walked in the room and, I don't want to be disparaging in any way, but the majority of the people were male and they were wearing blue blazers with the gold buttons and the bow tie and the shirt. And I walked in wearing a sundress, a jean jacket, and cowboy boots because that's kind of my aesthetic. Like that's, what I wear. And I never thought twice about it until I walked in that space and I looked around. And I don't think anyone looked at me and thought, who's this lady? What is she wearing? She sounds like she's not from Charleston. Those boots look like they've been through a couple of years. I don't think anyone thought that whatsoever. But I felt that. And coming back from that experience, I reflected heading into the next year that, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to own who I am. And if I were to show up to school on August 15th in a pantsuit and heels and my hair pressed and all of that, people would say, who is this lady? And so, I still have the jean jacket that I've had for 25 years,
nice.
And it's got holes, and my husband has helped patch it and stuff like that because I'm sentimentally attached to it. But it's like a garment that said, I'm not going to wear a blazer. I'm going to wear a jean jacket. I'm going to be who I am. And it's silly because it's clothing, but it was more than that to me. And I felt that way then when I would enter meetings, sitting around a board table with a lot of people who were, at the time that I started, much more experienced, degreed in educational leadership, had the blazers and all of that. I just said, well, if they asked me to do this, they asked me to do it for a reason that maybe is mysterious to me, but I'm not going to compromise who I am. And I think that sort of filtered into my relationships then with the kids in the school and then with my faculty. I wouldn't ask them to sacrifice who they were, because I believe authentic people are good teachers. Authentic leaders are good leaders.
I think that's a beautiful story. And authentic people are great in, I'm just learning the education space through my work with Porter-Gaud, which I have so much more respect for the deeper I go into it. But I think those same principles apply in the corporate world where I come from. And I think earlier in my career, I thought a lot about what I wore, how I came across, and I definitely copied others. And so that copied version, not just in what you wear, but how you act and how you speak, the copied version was safe and it was okay, but it was never great. And I remember the first time I gave a presentation that was truly my own. Like, I built the slides. The slides looked terrible because they were like, I'm pulling pictures from the internet to convey my thoughts.
Yeah.
And but I gave the presentation, and I could just feel the energy in the room, and people responded to it. And it was nerdy because I could describe myself that way too. A little quirky.
Yeah.
I threw out jokes. Some of them landed and many of them did not.
Right.
I'm like, moving on. But there was a change that day, and I still think about the impression, because you have to be self-aware to know what others around you, how they might experience you. And then you can sort of turn your dial around. Do you want to just let it stay out there and that's fine? Or do you want to say or do something that would address that perception if you care, but not, how do you do that and not change fundamentally who you are?
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a skill to knowing your audience. The way that I'm going to address 150 kids in a lunchroom is not going to be the same way that I'm going to sit around a table with executives at our school, or, something that relates to fundraising or something that relates to writing a mission statement. I mean, you have to be professional, but you can still let yourself shine through.
Yes. I think that's great. Yeah. I love that. And there's a mastery in that that I'm hoping our listeners will really think about and think about, what does that look like for themselves. Executive Access is brought to you by The Ideal Life. The Ideal Life offers a multimedia platform that is focused on cultivating a growth mindset. Here you'll find a supportive community, valuable content, and transformative coaching aimed at helping you live a more gratifying and joyful life. Ready to take the next step in your personal growth journey? Visit theideallife.com to explore their wealth of resources and join their vibrant, growing community today. I do want to go back to this idea of you being a reluctant leader, because I noticed that too. The first time I met you was actually hearing you present, but I had seen the communication about you being that reluctant leader. So I want to come back to that first, because first I want to talk about another area that just blew me away. So still, I didn't know you well. I was kind of observing, and this was during COVID. Now, COVID was just this major crisis for all of us in the world, and of course for the school system as well.
Right.
Porter-Gaud, I think, did a beautiful job relative to getting the school up fast on technology. Phil Zalby, DuBose Eggleston, amazing work. But I really feel like with COVID across any industry, that's where leadership is tested. And what I noticed during that time was that a lot of the innovations were coming right out of the middle school, right? I mean, we were really trying to be as normal as possible. And I had a kid in upper school, middle school, and I think lower school at the time. And you're like, hey, we're having back to school night and it's going to be outside and it's going to be social distance and we're going to do it in a different way. And I thought, wow, that's just one of many examples. The wellness program, I think, is best in class in the middle school division. I know Chris Tate had a lot to do with it. You had a lot to do with it. But the innovation coming out of middle school is absolutely your leadership. And I'm just so curious. Let's talk about COVID. How did you experience that? And how are you able to get people to think differently and to mobilize in that challenging time?
Yeah, that was hard. I think because it was a multi-headed monster. You had DHEC and the CDC telling you what you had to do, and we had to be compliant, with the CDC and with DHEC, and you had faculty who were scared. We had, families in the community who were scared. Everyone had a range of responses to how they felt COVID was. Was it a crisis? Was it inflated? Was it political? At the end of the day, I couldn't weigh in on any of that one way or another. And frankly, my opinion didn't matter. What mattered was I had the CDC and DHEC guidelines that I had to follow.
Sure.
And my guiding principle through all of it was to put the kids first, put the kids first. And that was tricky because I had faculty members who were fearful. We had a whole range of reactions to how should we do this? How should we do that? And even in putting the kids first, I knew that we'd be able to teach them. I knew that what they had learned the year before and what they were going to learn in the year following COVID, whenever, that we'd be able to make up that gap. We're a well-resourced school. We have talented faculty. So it's not that I had to take the learning and set it aside and say it's not important, but I had to focus on what's best for the kids. And what was best for the kids was for them to be in school for 6 to 8 hours a day and be among people, albeit 6 feet apart, which if you've ever been in a middle school, they can't stop touching each other, jumping on each other and smacking each other. But they needed to be together. And when everything outside the school was really fearful, I think they knew they could come in and they could count on seeing people, seeing each other, seeing their teachers. And so that was my guiding principle. And so anything that came up that they said, you can't do that, I would say, okay, well, what sort of way can we do this?
Wow.
And I remember meeting with our director of facilities for that back to school night. And he had this very dry sense of humor. He's since retired and I miss him. Al Trivet, he's fantastic. And the joke was anytime you asked Al for anything, his first answer would always be no, but then he would help you figure out how to do it. And so I met with him and I said, well, I had this idea for a parents' night out on the green and we'll have tables and we'll have it set up this way and we'll have staggered times. And he looked at me and he said, well, that's not the worst idea you've had. And I thought, victory!
Fantastic.
Like that must be a good idea, and he helped make that happen. So, I also had built-in relationships with people at the school who would support what sounded like wacky ideas from me, because I think they knew too that my guiding principle was what's best for the kids, what's best for us as a community. Parents were scared. They needed to see their teachers. So, it was something that kind of invited us all together and I think put some healing in place that we needed. And human interaction. That's what we needed. So definitely what's first for kids, but I think this is going to sound kind of braggy, so I almost don't want to say it, but I'm just going to say it. I think the thing that happy teachers are good teachers.
Yes.
Supported teachers are good teachers. Understood teachers. And I understood what they were going through. But the way that I really showed I understood what they were going through is I ended up teaching 2 classes that COVID year. And I think them seeing me step in a classroom and at that point we had kids were in one classroom and teachers would rotate in so that if a kid got sick, we didn't have to quarantine a whole grade. It would just be that little cohort. So every teacher had a cart and going up and down the hallway with all their things. Well, I did that twice a day while I was still division head, emailing, responding. So I think, again, kind of like our facilities person, when I had a wacky idea, people were more willing to jump in the deep end with me because they knew I was doing it and I was walking the walk. And anyone who stepped foot on campus, it would be like if aliens came from outer space and looked at what we were doing, they would say, what? You can only go up these stairs, down those? That makes no sense. Or you're eating in bleachers 6 feet apart. All that makes no sense. But, we did it.
This is so, you did it and you did it so well. And it was amazing. And it was safe and it was good and it was collaborative. I'm so excited because all I saw was the outcome. And because I geek out on leadership, I knew that there was like something phenomenal going on. Yeah. And the way you describe it, I want to make sure our listeners are really getting this because I'm going to pull out a couple things you said that are really powerful. One is this idea of a guiding principle. I love that because if you start there, then you never lose your way, right? I think if you start there, you can get people on board because no one would say, yeah, we shouldn't put kids first. So then as you move forward and someone feels like they're nervous about something, you just pop out that guiding principle and it's a reminder, this is the thing we all agreed to and it gives people confidence, right? So having that guiding principle, and I wonder when we lead how many times that we have a guiding principle and that we rally people around that first and we don't skip that step as we go do, right? So I thought that was great. I love this. I always say, what would need to be true for us to do this, like your innovation, right? So don't let limiting beliefs stop you, right? Because it would have been easy, I would imagine, am I right? Like to say, well, that's just not possible. Like we're just going to have to, deal with a way, right? So not letting that be the end of it.
Yeah. And, being open to that, it's going to take a lot of work. And that idea of a guiding principle, it wasn't a new thing because I had been division head since 2015. And I had seen the middle school through 2 pretty major changes before COVID hit. And so anyone who worked with me and for me knew my guiding principle was kids first, kids first. And that could make for some discomfort with faculty. And there are some teachers who probably didn't enjoy my leadership because I didn't compromise on that. And I would have to tell them like, no, let's look at this through the lens of a 13-year-old. Like, come on, So I don't think there was any doubt by the time we got to 2020 that was the lens that I brought to leading the middle school. And so that helped. I think if I just said in 2020, okay, now I'm switching and now we're kids first, people would be like, that makes no sense.
That's not authentic. That's not real.
Yeah. So when you build that relationship and you build that ethos, when something happens that's like a crisis, the people who you're leading, I think are more comfortable in saying, I trust you, because even what we're doing right now is so wholly different than what we've done. The philosophy and idea behind it is the same as what we've done.
And do you feel like when you put out these big principles, because that's principle, your job was enormous. You had a big school to lead, lots of teachers, parents interaction, lots of constituents, children, parents, and, faculty members. Yeah. Do you find, like, you can't manage every decision every day, but do you find when you put out these principles, it guides others to make decisions along those lines better every day too?
I would hope so. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of when I hire, my questions are always based on that principle or what's important to me or what we have established. And so, there are human resources questions and you can choose from this bank. And oftentimes those questions align with what I would ask anyway. But, when I'm given a bank of 20 questions and it's like, which ones are you going to ask? I'm like, this is the one that's most important to me. And it's always going to be the one that aligns with the mission I've established. So, so I think making sure you're surrounding yourself with people. And if you have people who you kind of inherit, which I did inherit a lot of staff, if they're not on board with that, seeing like, what can I get you to do to understand that this is what we're in this for?
Yes, this is who we are. This is what we do.
And trying to push people along that process, or saying, okay, if this is our mission, how can I see that in what you do? And acknowledging that, student first, kid first looks different for 10 different teachers. But, as a discerning leader, you should be able to see evidence of that. And that was probably the hardest thing for me, is when I would see something and I'm like, you're not showing evidence of kid first.
Yeah.
And
it means something, because it's like a drumbeat. And I would say in the corporate world, two things come to mind. Values, when we do them right, are something that we come back to over and over again. It's sort of the corporate values. Or also, as I've helped, many leaders prepare for interviews, and they always say, I know someone's going to ask me what my leadership principles are. What's my leadership style? And to me, it's all about, like, well, what do you stand for?
Right.
What is your belief about yourself leading and about this business and this point in time where we are? So I love the way you've said guiding principles. I'm gonna use that from now on. The other thing that you said, at Microsoft, there was some, really important things that all leaders were trained on, and they come with little mantras.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was model, coach, care. And I heard model when you were talking about rolling up your sleeves and just experiencing it with the team, being in the trenches. Back to what you said earlier about, I understand what you're going through, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I empathize, and therefore we're in this together. That modeling, I think, is a really special way to lead.
Yeah. And, being vulnerable and owning when you mess up too. I made plenty of mistakes, and being able to say, I got that one wrong. Let's try this again. I think gives people not only freedom to feel accepted, if their mistake comes from a good place, but it also encourages taking risk. And, obviously you don't want to take like bad risks.
Sure.
Well thought out, say like, let's climb the Empire State Building without ropes, but, try something new. And so a teacher, I think, could feel comfortable coming to me and saying, I really want to try this project with my students, but I have no idea how it's going to work out. And I'm like, looks like some good learning, looks like good student leadership in there, go for it and do it. And so, that coaching and that modeling, but also that comfort that I'm going to be here when you mess up, because I've messed up and I own it.
And how do I wish leaders would do this more, to basically fess up when they make a mistake and own it, right? Not in a, weepy sort of way that people all of a sudden lose confidence in their leader, but sort of a matter of fact, like, hey, I did this. I wish I would have done this way. This is what we're going to do better next time. And I'm curious, when you did that, how did your team experience you, or how did you experience your team experiencing you when that happened?
It's funny, because one of the COVID things, in order to have all the kids in the same room at the same time, we had to make one critical call in what that would look like and how would those groups be done. And we didn't know how long we were going to be in those cohorts. So if you have 18 middle school kids in a classroom at 8 o'clock and they're in it until 3:15, 5 days a week, you better make sure that mix of 18 kids is a functional mix, because you could have like a prison riot. You know what I mean? Like, you have to make sure. And I had to weigh, is it better to have the right mix of 18 kids, or for them to be grouped by their math ability? And I made the call, it's got to be by personality. It's got to be by, group dynamic. And because of that, we could do some in-person classes, but then like halfway through the day it would switch, and they would be in that space Zooming with their math teacher. And then a couple hours later, same thing with language. We have 4 different languages. So they would be in that same space Zooming with a Chinese teacher, and one kid next to them would be taking Spanish. It was bananas. I don't know what I would have done differently, but it was one thing that after sitting with the math and the language teachers, I was like, look, this is not ideal. And I'm sorry. I wish I had a different solution. I appreciate you playing along with this grand experiment. And thankfully, I think a month and a half into the school year, we were able to switch and go back to having in-person math and in-person language.
Nice.
But it was a desperate choice to have the kids there and to have that social glue, which I felt like was more important than maybe what they were learning in math. But the math teachers were not happy with me, and the language teachers were not happy with me. So I just had to own it and say, it is what it is. We're all here. We're together. Let's focus on that. And then as soon as we could switch to in-person, I was like, do you want longer classes? Like, what's something I can do to try to fix this?
Excellent. And I think, the iteration, I'm going to guess that if the situation would have been another 6 months where you had to operate in that environment, no doubt you would have just said, okay, how are we going to iterate on this? Because we didn't get it perfect the first time.
Right.
Very growth mindset kind of, let's learn and let's continue to iterate and go. I have to say one thing because I just think it's funny. When you said I'm braggy, what I learned after I left Microsoft and I started coaching a lot of senior people, I would often hear something that sounded like, this is going to sound braggy, but usually it's, when I'm trying to, hey, what about being more direct or bold? And I would hear something like over and over again, well, I don't want to step on people's toes.
Right.
And I just had this epiphany, and I'm going to test this out on you because I'm curious what you think about this, right? I think that nearly 100% of the time, anybody that would say, I don't want to be braggy or I don't want to step on people's toes, actually, I don't even think it's possible that they do. Because I think that the people who do step on toes and are braggy, it may never occur to them, right?
They're not self-aware.
They're not self-aware. So I just wonder if you're one of those people that's listening and you're like, well, I'm worried about coming across this way. I mean, listen to that. It's a good, it's a good check on yourself, but also step up out in boldness, because just the fact that you have that awareness probably tells me that you're going to do it the right way. What do you think about that?
No, I totally agree with you. And it's one of those, especially as a female, we have phrases that we start sentences with, or apologize when we're not really apologizing, but we feel like we should because it sounds polite. And so I totally agree with you saying this is going to sound braggy, and then proceed to say what you're going to say. Just say it,
I was actually wondering if you did it deliberately, because as soon as you said it, I was like, now I really want to hear what you have to say. So that might be your secret sauce.
Maybe, I don't know. I think it's a filler phrase that, probably stems from a place of, I'm not comfortable talking about myself.
Yes.
That is just not even though I like to tell stories, I'm generally uncomfortable. And sometimes I'm really critical as an audience member when I see someone talking and I'm thinking, how many times is that person going to say I when it should be a we?
That's right. That's right. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I was curious on your perspective.
Yeah.
One other thing you brought up earlier about being the reluctant leader, I remember thinking that about you as well. In fact, it might have even been in your announcement. After a far and wide search for a principal,
yes,
we have found the best person home here at Porter-Gaud. She is a reluctant leader stepping in, but we've asked her to, and she is. And I just remember smiling at that. And, you were a teacher, happy to be a teacher. You get tapped to be the principal. Talk to me about why you did it. What made you say yes? I'm just so curious about that, because I think our listeners are also thinking about their career changes. Sometimes they're tapped for things. Sometimes they're aspiring for something.
Right.
Talk to me about that.
So it's interesting because even before that, I have had life experiences where I have not sought leadership, but I've had people say, we need you to do this. And so, the first is I wanted to be a chef, right, when I graduated from undergrad. And my mother gave me great advice. She said, work in a restaurant full-time for 2 years. And if you love it, go to culinary school, do it the right way. So I worked in this restaurant as a cook, and I worked with this master chef who was amazing. I was 21, 22 years old at the time, and just soaking up and learning an unbelievable amount. Well, I think chefs are known for being kind of temperamental at times, and he threw a tantrum and he quit.
Oh.
And so I was 21 years old, and the owner of the restaurant said, I need you to run the back of the house. And I had people that I worked with who were significantly older and more experienced. And I thought, why is he asking me? And he said, no, Maureen, I need you to do this. I was like, okay. So I just stepped up and I did it. And then even working for an airline, I got tapped on the shoulder and they said, we want to put you in the management pool. And I was like, well, I've only been here 3 months. Even as a classroom teacher, we had a former head of school who left to go work at another school. And he came back a year later and said, can you meet me for coffee? And I said, sure. And he said, I would like you to come be our middle school principal. And I was like, I'm a teacher. Like, I do not want. And so then 2 years later, when Randy died and they asked me to step in temporarily, of course, I wanted to help my colleagues. I wanted to provide some kind of healing and consistency. But at that point, I was like, people must see something in me that I ought to do this. But even then, I thought it was going to be temporary. I thought it was going to be,
Until
just that
found.
school year. And then they said, well, it takes a while to find someone, so we need you to do it one more year. And I was like, okay, I'll do it one more year. And then as I started seeing the different people they were interviewing to bring them in, I thought, I can do this, and I have done it. And I love this place, and I love these people. So I think what motivated me to get out of the way of myself was an abiding love for that school and an abiding love for my colleagues and a belief in the mission of what we were doing.
Hmm. What do you think it is that, because this is a pattern now, this is a theme of people tapping you. Have you reflected at all on what it is that you do or how you are that gives people confidence to tap you for things, maybe even before you're even thinking about them or feel like you're ready?
Well, I did when you asked me to do this. And then I started thinking, because we had talked a little about the reluctant leader. And that's kind of when I started looking back at this kind of pattern. And, even who I am socially with my friends, I think the role I even play in my family to a certain extent. I don't know. I think I would hope it's like a lack of ego and a belief in something bigger. And maybe that's why people ask me to do something, like just a belief in intention and purpose. I think I'm a smart person, so that helps, but I really think it's, I show up every day, and I show up every day 100%. And I think that is sometimes rare, which is sad, but I don't do things halfway. And so I think that's it. Like, I think DuBose, and at the time our board chair, he knew, like, she's going to show up every day and she has a work ethic. She's not going to let this flounder. And maybe that's what I needed to hear it from, a restaurant owner and a corporate executive at American Airlines. Like, maybe I needed to hear that from other people 5 times before I could say, like, I show up and I believe in something and I don't do anything halfway. I don't come from a, wealthy background. Like, I was raised by people who worked hard. And they showed up. They showed up for family. They showed up for their jobs, no matter what they were.
Well, I love that. You show up. And this idea, this belief in something bigger, just betting that the way that translates is how you interact with others, how you see your job as not just doing your job well, but how it interacts with everything around you. And I think that's what a leader is all about, a big part of it. Do you ever wish that you would have raised your hand sooner for some of these things?
Yes and no. Some of them I didn't have a choice. The restaurant one, I had no choice. He was like, we're
Definitely
opening
not that
in
one.
an hour. You have to do this. But it was a very good experience because I realized I don't want to be a chef. I think one of the reasons why I was a good principal was because I had taught for, a number of years. So there's a lot of people who get into education and they teach a year or two, and then they, go work for the district or go work in a administrative level. I learned a ton in the classroom. But interestingly, as soon as I became a principal about a year into it, I always knew I was going to return to teaching because I was like, I have some unfinished business. Like, there were things that I had been approaching in the wrong way, and seeing it from the other perspective, I knew I was going to end my career going back in the classroom. So I don't regret not having done it sooner, because I think through that kind of rooted process, I learned how to be a better leader.
That's great. Well, this doesn't apply to you because you didn't necessarily have these feelings, but given that you said you reflected back, why are people tapping me? I feel like there's somebody listening that needs to hear this. Raise your hand. Raise your hand because there's
Yeah.
so many.
Do it. Say, I'm here.
I'm here. I think sometimes when I mentor, not even so much coach early in career professionals, a lot of women, but sometimes men too, they think about all the things that they don't have for that next job versus thinking about all the things they do. And I always say, well, you wouldn't take that job if you had everything because you still have to learn and grow. So I don't know, maybe I just have this feeling that somebody needs to hear that out there. Raise your hands.
Yeah. And put yourself out there. It is so vulnerable. I remember that formal interview process and looking around the table and seeing people who had been my colleagues. We started out at Porter-Gaud together. We had babies together and, now they're interviewing me. And I'm thinking, this is going to be so embarrassing if I don't get this. Forget that. You have to forget that. And even in mentoring faculty members over the year who've said, I really want to grow at the school. I really want to have a leadership role at the school. Teaching by structure is not really, the leadership opportunities, formal ones, are kind of hard to come by. And so I'm always very impressed with people who raise their hand, people who put themselves out there and go through a process and maybe don't get the outcome that they wanted, but show up in that way. It's really powerful. And that vulnerability is, to me, astounding. So
something good always comes out of it, even if it's not the thing you think it's going to be.
Absolutely.
Well, Maureen, this has been so great. And I am finally somewhat satisfied around all these things I was so curious about, although we'll have to talk offline about some others. As we move to wrap up, there's one question I'd love to ask you. And it is, if you could only give one piece of advice about being a leader, what would that be?
I think it's show up as yourself, show up as yourself, be you and be present.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, this has been a great conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I did. It was not as nerve-wracking as I thought it was going to be, but I can get caught up in talking, so that helps.
Me too. Well, thank you. I look forward to seeing you next year at Porter-Gaud as well.
Yeah. And on the
soccer field. Get up. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Please join us every Tuesday as we continue to bring you insider access to executive leadership.